Tonight we begin where the fields grow quiet and the rock remembers. In East Lothian, where the fields roll softly toward the sea, a dark volcanic rock rises without warning. On that rock stands Dirleton Castle, its round towers fused together like a clenched fist, grown straight from the basalt beneath. It was built with continental ambition and Scottish patience, fireproof, mine-proof, unhurried. And then we turn inland, to Craigmillar. South of Edinburgh the land rises just enough to matter, a low ridge, a wide sky, Arthur's Seat watching from the distance like a dormant thought. Craigmillar Castle sits there in composed silence, its L-plan tower thick and deliberate. The fire is warm, the stone is ancient. There is nothing left for you to do now but listen, and let the night settle softly between two quiet fortresses that learned, in their own ways, how to endure. Long before there were walls, there was the rock. In the gentle, rolling farmland of East Lothian, the geography is mostly soft. The soil is deep, the horizon is flat, and the coastline drifts quietly into the North Sea. But at Dirleton, the earth interrupts itself. A plug of volcanic basalt, hard, jagged and ancient, punches up through the green fields. It is an igneous outcrop left over from a violent geological past, a small island of stone in a sea of agriculture. For thousands of years, people have lived in the shadow of this rock. The surrounding landscape is thick with the invisible signatures of the Neolithic and Bronze Ages, buried roundhouses, ritual pits, and the faint crop marks of early field systems. This has always been the Garden of Scotland, a place where the harvest is reliable and the living is, by prehistoric standards, relatively easy. And as anyone who has ever owned a garden knows, if you grow something nice, someone else will eventually try to steal it. Yet strangely, the rock itself remained empty. In the Iron Age, when hill forts were being raised on almost every prominent ridge in the Lothians, this crag was left alone. Perhaps it was too small to shelter a tribe and their cattle. Perhaps it was too exposed to the biting winds off the Forth. Or perhaps it was simply that the people here didn't feel the need to hide on top of it. They lived around it, not on it. The name they eventually gave this place tells us exactly what mattered to them. Dirleton comes from the Old English Dirleton. It doesn't mean fortress of the warrior or hill of the king. It means deer enclosure, or a farmstead where animals were managed. For centuries, this outcrop wasn't a military asset. It was a piece of agricultural infrastructure. It was a place to pen livestock, a landmark for shepherds, a part of the working day. So, when the stone walls finally rose in the 13th century, they were not creating importance where none existed. They were merely formalising it. The castle did not invent the value of this land. It simply announced that the days of sharing it were over. The deer enclosure was about to become a donjon. In the middle of the 13th century, the ownership of this volcanic plug passed to John de Vaux. De Vaux was technically a Scottish baron. He held court here, collected rents here, and enforced the king's law here. But his headspace was strictly continental. He was an Anglo-Norman noble, a member of a caste that viewed the English Channel less as a border and more as a commute. He moved, married, and fought across a Europe that was far more interconnected than we often assume. To a man like de Vaux, the local architecture of East Lothian likely looked rustic, perhaps even a bit quaint. The standard Scottish castle of the time was a square tower house, a simple, brutal box of stone designed to keep the rain out and the neighbours away. It was functional, but it was not sophisticated. De Vaux decided he didn't want a box. He wanted a statement. When he began construction around 1240, he did not hire local builders to pile up local stone. He imported a concept. He looked to the high-tech military complexes of northern France, specifically the great fortress of Château de Coucy. He was the medieval equivalent of a tech CEO, building a California-style glass mansion in the middle of a rainy sheep farm. He wanted his neighbours to know that he had better taste than them, and that he had significantly more money than them. But this kind of statement takes time. The castle wasn't raised in a season. For years, the quiet farmland was disrupted by the noise of an industrial project. Scaffolding shrouded the rock. Ox carts churned the mud of the Dirleton into a construction site. Devoe likely imported master masons from the continent, men who spoke French and looked at the local basalt with suspicion. The local labourers, used to building simple square keeps, were suddenly asked to construct something entirely alien, a cluster donjon. In Scotland, a keep was usually a single miserable square tower. Devoe rejected this. He built a fused mass of 3 round towers, grouped together like a fist. This was clustered architecture. It was complex, it was geometric, and it required a level of engineering that likely gave the local workforce a migraine. But the choice of round towers wasn't just about looking modern, it was about ballistics. A square tower has corners. A corner is a structural liability. It is the weak point where a battering ram can bite, or where a miner can knock out the coins to bring the whole wall down. A corner also creates a blind spot, a sliver of ground where an attacker can stand without being seen. A round tower has no corners. Missiles from siege engines glance off the curved surface like rain off a windshield. By building round, Devoe was buying the premium package. He was paying extra for aerodynamics. Inside this stone fist, the sophistication continued. The interior was not a dark, dripping cell. It was a lord's hall of exceptional quality, polygonal in shape to follow the curve of the towers. But the most significant feature was the ceiling. It was rib-vaulted in stone. This was not just for grandeur, it was an insurance policy. In the 13th century, the greatest enemy of a castle was not the trebuchet or the arrow, it was the torch. Most castles fell because their timber floors caught fire, turning the keep into a vertical furnace. By vaulting his hall in stone, Devoe was fireproofing his legacy. It was a pragmatic realization that while wood is cheap, stone endures. If the lower castle fell, he could retreat to this chamber and wait for the smoke to clear. Finally, there was the matter of the foundation. Devoe did not dig trenches in the clay. He built directly on the protruding knob of volcanic basalt. The masonry grows out of the rock so seamlessly that it is difficult to tell where the geology ends and the architecture begins. This too was a specific countermeasure against a specific headache: mining. The most effective way to take a castle in this era was to dig a tunnel under the wall, prop it with timber, and burn the props to collapse the defence. It was silent, invisible, and devastating. But you cannot mine through volcanic basalt. By anchoring his French towers to the Scottish rock, Devoe quietly removed an entire category of threat from his risk assessment. The finished castle was a machine for survival. It was fireproof. It was mine-proof. It was deflected by curves and anchored in stone. It stood on the rock, a piece of continental technology dropped into a Scottish field, waiting for the war that would inevitably come to test the warranty. By 1298, the investment in French architecture was about to be audited. The Wars of Independence had begun, and the rich, fertile farmland of East Lothian underwent a rebranding. It was no longer the Garden of Scotland, it was a logistics corridor. In medieval warfare, we tend to focus on the battles: Stirling Bridge, Falkirk, Bannockburn. We like the maps with the little arrows, but battles are actually rare. The day-to-day reality of war is simply moving breakfast from point A to point B without it getting stolen. An army of thousands is essentially a moving city that needs to be fed every single day. Whoever held Dirleton Castle controlled the road between Edinburgh and the English border. They controlled the flow of bread, beef, and iron. The castle was no longer a residence for a cosmopolitan noble. It was a valve on the main artery of Scotland. If you couldn't open the valve, your army starved. In 1298, Edward I of England, fresh from his victory at Falkirk, found this valve closed against him. He needed to secure his supply lines, but he didn't lead the assault himself. He was busy managing a kingdom. Instead, he delegated the problem to a man who understood the intersection of faith and force, Anthony Beck, the Bishop of Durham. We might find it strange today to send a bishop to conduct a siege. We imagine a man of the cloth to be a figure of peace, perhaps holding a book rather than a plan of attack. But Anthony Beck was a prince bishop. In the feudal structure, a bishop wasn't just a spiritual guide, he was a senior administrator. He controlled vast estates, collected taxes from thousands of souls, and managed a workforce of masons, clerks, and soldiers. When Edward sent Beck to Dirleton, he wasn't sending a warrior in the romantic sense. He was sending a project manager with a very large budget. Beck arrived not just with prayers, but with a retinue of military engineers, miners, and a siege train. He viewed the castle not as a noble adversary, but as a structural violation of the king's peace that needed to be rectified. In the medieval church, the line between saving souls and smashing heads was often surprisingly thin. However, upon arrival, the bishop discovered that the de Vaux's investment in French architecture was paying dividends. The siege began with the usual violence. The English engineers set up their engines, huge timber-framed catapults designed to smash stone. They let fly. But the round towers of the cluster donjon did exactly what they were designed to do. The missiles didn't strike flat surfaces. They glanced off the curves, spinning away harmlessly into the brush. Frustrated, Beck ordered the miners forward. This was the standard solution for a stubborn wall. Dig under it, prop it, and burn it. The miners advanced under shields, reached the base of the walls, and struck their picks into the ground. And they hit volcanic basalt. The geology suddenly became very relevant. You cannot sap a volcano. The pickaxes sparked and dulled against the rock. There would be no tunnels, no collapsing walls, and no easy breach. The bishop found himself in a stalemate, staring up at a fortress that simply refused to participate in his schedule. When the engineering failed, the siege shifted gears. It ceased to be a military operation and became a contest of inventory management. The bishop realised that while he couldn't break the walls, he could simply wait for the people inside to run out of lunch. The English army outside the walls also had to eat, and this is where the true cost of the siege was paid, not by the soldiers, but by the land. To feed his troops, Beck ordered the stripping of the countryside. The English soldiers fanned out into the fields. They didn't just take the surplus, they took everything. They harvested the peas and the beans that were still in the fields. They broke into the granaries of the local tenant farmers. They slaughtered the breeding cattle. This is the depth of the conflict that rarely makes it into the history books. A siege is a localized event, but the hunger it creates is regional. The army was eating the future. By consuming the seed grain, they were guaranteeing that even after they marched away, the famine would remain. The farmers of East Lothian watched their livelihood disappear into the bellies of the besiegers, financing the king's war with their winter survival. It was a slow, grinding theft that took weeks. Inside the castle, the garrison was safe from the bombardment. The stone vaults protected them from fire. The basalt protected them from mining. But the de Vaux family had built a castle for a noble household, not a regiment. The well was deep, but not infinite. The larder was stocked for a family dinner, not a garrison's survival. After weeks of holding out, the physics of biology took over. The defenders were not beaten by bravery or by a breach in the wall. They were beaten by thirst. The surrender, when it came, was quiet. The gates opened not because they were broken, but because the men behind them were too weak to hold them shut. Anthony Beck rode into the courtyard, his armour polished and his administration successful. He had taken the castle, but looking at the undamaged walls and the starving men, the lesson was clear. The architecture had worked perfectly. The stone had done its job. The castle didn't fail. The logistics did. By the middle of the 14th century, the Devoe line had withered, and the castle passed by marriage to the Haliburton family. The Haliburtons were less interested in French elegance and more interested in Scottish practicality. They looked at the battered shell of the old donjon, scarred by the wars of independence, and decided that patching it up wasn't enough. Castles in this era weren't treated as family heirlooms to be preserved for the tourists. They were machines to be upgraded. If the machine wasn't working, you didn't polish it, you rebuilt it. The Haliburtons realised that the threat landscape had changed. The danger wasn't just a massive siege army anymore. It was smaller, faster raids. So they shifted the centre of gravity of the entire fortress. They stopped worrying about the round towers and focused everything on the front door. This upgrade didn't happen overnight. For nearly a generation, Dirleton ceased to be a quiet residence and became a permanent construction site. If you lived there in 1360, your life was a soundtrack of chisels and shouting. Dust from the limestone settled into the wine cups and the tapestries. The Haliburtons were essentially living inside a major renovation project that never seemed to end. They constructed a massive new gatehouse. This wasn't a welcoming entrance. It was a stone funnel designed to compress a crowd into a target. And it wasn't just for armies. For decades, every cart of grain, every visiting priest, and every barrel of ale had to pass through this dark, constricted throat. It was architecture as regulation. By controlling the door, the Haliburtons controlled the economy of the entire estate. It was the medieval equivalent of a security checkpoint where the metal detector is replaced by a man with a spear. Above the passage they installed a murder hole. This is exactly what it sounds like. A simple gap in the vaulting that allowed defenders to drop heavy objects, boiling water, or just bad news on anyone trying to breach the gate. While this was a brutal piece of engineering, its primary function was actually psychological. The knowledge that the ceiling might open up at any moment forced everyone, friend or foe, to look up when they should have been looking forward. It introduced a moment of hesitation. It built a permanent anxiety into the architecture itself. In a siege, hesitation is usually fatal. The Haliburtons understood that you don't always need to kill an attacker. Sometimes you just need to make him second-guess his career choices. But the most efficient part of the Haliburton design wasn't what they built up, it was what they dug down. Beneath the guard room lies a pit prison, a dark, bottle-shaped dungeon cut into the solid rock. This was the oubliette, a name derived from the French word oublier, to forget. We tend to imagine these places filled with rival warlords, but on most Tuesdays the pit held no great dramatic enemies. It held debtors. It held hostages waiting for a transfer of funds. It held men whose names were written down in a ledger once and then never spoken again. In the complex web of Scottish feuds, executing a man was messy. It created martyrs. It guaranteed that his sons would come back to burn your crops for the next 20 years. It was often politically safer to simply lower a problem into the dark and selectively misplace the rope. The pit didn't require a headsman or a trial. It just required a very heavy grate and a short memory. It was the ultimate administrative solution to a personnel problem. By the turn of the 16th century, the Haliburtons were gone, and the castle passed to the Ruthvens. With the arrival of the Ruthven family, the fundamental purpose of Dirleton Castle began to drift. For 300 years, this rock had been a military asset. It was a machine designed to stop English armies and hold the East Lothian road. But the Ruthvens were a different breed of noble. They understood that in 16th century Scotland, power was no longer determined by how many cows you could steal or how thick your walls were. It was determined by how close you could stand to the king without getting arrested. The centre of gravity had shifted. The real war wasn't happening on the border anymore. It was happening in the corridors of Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh. And if the nature of power had changed, the architecture had to keep up. To reflect this new reality, the Ruthvens decided they were done with living in a dark, damp drum tower. The old Devoe keep was safe, but it was miserable. It was built for survival, not for living. So over the course of several summers, the sound of the mason's hammer returned to the rock. But this time, the rhythm was different. They weren't building a fortification. They were building a home. They constructed a new range of buildings that would have been unrecognisable to the old warlords who first staked a claim here. This was the Renaissance lodging. They added large fireplaces that actually drew smoke away rather than filling the room with it. They laid down timber floors that didn't sap the heat out of your feet like the old stone flags. They commissioned painted ceilings, turning the overhead space from a defensive vault into a canvas for art. Most shockingly, they punched large glazed windows into the stonework facing the gardens. To a medieval military architect, a large window is a heresy. It is a structural hole in your defence. It is an invitation for an arrow, a ladder or a stone. But the Ruthvens were pragmatists. They knew that by the 1500s, the rules of engagement had changed permanently. The invention of gunpowder artillery had rendered the old high walls obsolete. If a modern siege train arrived with heavy cannon, it didn't matter if your wall was 5 feet thick or 10 feet thick, it was coming down. The Ruthvens realised that comfort no longer increased their risk profile. Since the walls were now purely decorative against modern artillery, there was no point in suffering in the dark. You might as well enjoy the view of the garden while you waited for the siege to start. The glass wasn't a sign of peace, it was a sign of resignation to the new physics of war. But the light streaming through those new windows illuminated a different kind of danger. The Ruthvens were deeply involved in the highest levels of Scottish politics, a game that was significantly more lethal and much faster than border warfare. The family was central to the Ruthven Raid, a coup that involved kidnapping the young King James VI. They were later implicated in the Gowrie conspiracy. These were not battlefield manoeuvres, they were whispered conversations in quiet rooms. In the 13th century, if you wanted to destroy a family like the Devoe, you had to march an army north, sit in the mud for 6 weeks, and starve them out. It was slow, expensive, and uncertain. In the 16th century, you could destroy the Ruthvens in an afternoon. The family didn't lose Dirleton to a battering ram or a trebuchet. They lost it to a political miscalculation in Edinburgh. Following the conspiracy, their lands were forfeited to the crown. The king simply signed a piece of paper, and the castle was gone. The Ruthvens proved that a family could be destroyed much faster by a signature on a piece of parchment than by a catapult. In the end, the most dangerous thing in the castle wasn't a soldier, it was a lawyer. By the late 16th century, the danger had shifted again. It no longer came from English armies marching up the road or from rival families plotting in Edinburgh. It came from the weather. The coastline of East Lothian is battered by the North Sea. Storms here are sudden and violent, capable of sinking a merchant ship or a royal fleet in an hour. In a pre-scientific age, a sudden storm wasn't just meteorology, it was malice. And if the king's ship was tossed by waves, as happened to James VI on his return from Denmark, someone had to be blamed for it. The shadow of the North Berwick witch trials fell heavily on Dirleton. The castle, once a fortress against physical armies, was repurposed as a holding facility for a much more elusive enemy. We often imagine witch trials as chaotic village green hysteria, pitchforks and shouting. But the reality at Dirleton was far quieter and far more dangerous. The castle became a processing centre. The pit prison, the same hole in the rock that the Halliburtons had dug for their enemies, was now filled with local women. These weren't political prisoners. They were midwives, healers, and unpleasant neighbours who had the bad luck to survive a hard winter when others didn't. The context here is crucial. This was the era of the Little Ice Age. Crops were failing, cattle were dying, and religious anxiety was at a fever pitch. When the world feels broken, People don't look for complex socio-economic reasons. They look for a scapegoat. For months, the accused didn't just disappear. They waited. They sat in the dark, listening to the damp drip down the limestone walls, waiting for the arrival of a specialist. This specialist was the witch pricker. Men like John Kincaid made a career out of this fear. They weren't religious zealots so much as they were technicians. They arrived with their tools, long, sharp needles, and went to work with the detachment of a surveyor looking for dry rot. Their job was to find the devil's mark, a spot on the body that didn't bleed or feel pain. It is worth noting the economics of this arrangement. The prickers were paid by the town, often with a bonus for every positive identification. It was a system that incentivized results. If you pay a man to find witches, he will generally find them. It was a gig economy of persecution, billable by the witch. The tragedy of the witch trials wasn't just the rage, it was the paperwork. The persecution was bureaucratic. It required clerks to write down the confessions, jailers to turn the keys, and judges to sign the warrants. Dirleton Castle, built to keep the English out, found itself defenceless against this internal rot. The walls were 15 feet thick, but they couldn't stop a rumour. The enemy was no longer outside the gate, it was inside the community. The castle had become a machine for processing its own neighbours, proving that while stone can stop a cannonball, it is completely permeable to paranoia. By 1650, Dirleton Castle was technically a dinosaur. In the age of field artillery, professional standing armies, and geometric star forts, a medieval stone fortress was about as relevant to modern warfare as a chariot. But even dinosaurs can be dangerous if they fall on you. Following the execution of Charles I, the British Isles were in chaos. Scotland was a patchwork of allegiances, and Dirleton Castle found itself occupied by a group of royalist guerrillas known as Moss Troopers. These men were not the disciplined knights of the De Vaux era, nor were they the courtly politicians of the Ruthven line. They were essentially bandits with a political pamphlet. They used the castle not as a capital, but as a forward operating base. The Moss Troopers understood that while the castle couldn't stop a modern army in a pitched battle, it was still a perfect warehouse for stolen goods and a nightmare to police. It offered height, dry storage, and walls that were still 15 feet thick. It was a logistical thorn in the side of the parliamentarian advance. It forced the enemy to divert resources to deal with them. It was the 17th century equivalent of an insurgency hiding in a bunker complex. They couldn't win the war, but they could make the occupation incredibly expensive. Oliver Cromwell, a man who viewed inefficiency as a personal insult to God, had no patience for this. He didn't send a herald to negotiate. He sent Generals Monk and Lambert with heavy artillery. But they didn't just bring cannons to batter the walls. Cannons are direct fire weapons. They require a line of sight. Instead, the parliamentarians deployed mortars. The arrival of the mortar changed the geometry of the siege entirely. For 400 years, architects like De Vaux and the Halliburtons had obsessed over the horizontal threat. They built walls to stop things coming at them. They thickened the curtains, rounded the towers, and dug the ditches. They hadn't planned for things coming down on them. The mortar shell is a projectile that ignores the wall entirely. It is lobbed in a high, lazy arc, peaking high above the battlements, before dropping vertically into the courtyard. This was a loophole in the physics of the castle that no amount of basalt foundation could fix. The Ruthven's fancy glass windows and the Halliburton's murder hole were useless against gravity. The vertical masonry that had once been a shield was now just a container for the explosion. The defenders were trapped in a stone bowl while explosives rained from the sky. The surrender was inevitable, but the aftermath was the real innovation. The English army didn't just capture the castle, they slighted it. The English engineers identified the structural key to the fortress, the massive inner gatehouse and the adjacent towers, and they undermined them. They didn't just damage them, they brought them down in a controlled landslide of masonry. This wasn't wanton vandalism, it was a cost-saving measure. Cromwell knew that a standing castle requires a garrison to hold it. You have to pay soldiers, feed them, and repair the roof. A standing castle is a liability on the balance sheet. A ruin, however, requires nothing. It costs £0 a year to maintain a pile of rocks. By breaking the castle's back, the parliamentarians were simply closing a loophole in their budget. The moss troopers were scattered or hanged, and the great French donjon was left as a pile of jagged teeth. It was permanently retired from the business of war, not by a heroic final stand, but by a demolition order signed to save on overhead. By 1660, the age of the fortress was definitively over. The castle had been slighted, its back broken by Cromwell's engineers. The moss troopers were gone, the witches were gone. The noise of 400 years of warfare, the shouting, the chisels, the cannons, finally stopped. Into this silence stepped the Nisbet family. Sir John Nisbet was not a warlord. He was a lawyer, specifically the Lord Advocate of Scotland. He was a man of statutes and contracts, not sieges and sallies. When he acquired the Dirleton estate, he looked at the shattered silhouette of the Devoe donjon, broken by mortars and reclaimed by ivy, and made a decision that would have baffled the old medieval builders. He didn't fix it, he didn't knock it down, he simply mowed the lawn around it. To the Nisbets, a ruined castle wasn't a defensive liability, it was a landscape feature. It was the 17th century equivalent of buying a house with a rustic exposed brick wall, except this wall had been blasted by artillery. They understood a new kind of status. In the 13th century, power was displayed by building walls thick enough to keep people out. In the 17th century, power was displayed by owning those walls and not needing them. It was a status symbol of restraint. It said, "My ancestors might have fought for this rock, but I am secure enough to just look at it." The transformation of the site was slow and deliberate. It took years of quiet, diligent gardening to tame the wreckage. The rubble from the collapsed East Tower was cleared away not by military engineers, but by groundskeepers. The inner ward, once a muddy yard full of nervous soldiers, screaming horses, and the smell of unwashed armour, was levelled. They turned the heart of the fortress into a bowling green. The ground that had been soaked in blood during the siege of 1298 was now rolled and manicured. Where archers once scanned the horizon for English banners, gentlemen in silk waistcoats now politely debated the bias of a wooden ball. On a quiet Tuesday in July, the loudest sound in the castle wasn't the roar of a cannon, but the gentle clack of woods and the polite applause of a lawyer who had just won a wager. The castle ceased to be a tool. It became scenery. But the Nisbets were still Scottish, which means they were still practical. While they enjoyed the romance of the ruin, they also understood the economics of the estate. Just beyond the castle walls stands one of the best preserved ducots in Scotland. This beehive-shaped structure houses over 1,000 nesting boxes for pigeons. To us, in the modern world, pigeons are urban pests. To a 17th century landowner, they were winter batteries. In the months when cattle were too skinny to slaughter and the grain was running low, a ducot provided a steady, reliable supply of fresh meat and eggs. It was an automated protein factory that ran on grain and produced squab. It required no herding, no fencing, and very little labour. This was a subtle shift in how power was expressed. The Devoe had projected strength through stone towers and murder holes, active, violent defence. The Nisbets projected strength through a full larder. Owning a massive stone-built pigeon house was a declaration that you could feed your household through the darkest months of the year without struggle. The murder hole was designed to take life. The ducot was designed to sustain it. Both were machines of power, but the Nisbets understood that in the long run, lunch is more important than war. By 1850, the transformation was complete. The castle had ceased to be a machine for war and had become a backdrop for horticulture. The Victorians arrived at Dirleton with their absolute conviction that nature was something to be tidied up, Labelled and put into a hierarchy, they looked at the jagged ruins of the Devaux donjon and saw an opportunity. They didn't see a fortress, they saw a trellis. Under the care of the new owners, the gardens expanded dramatically. The moat, which for centuries had been a stagnant ditch filled with refuse and defensive mud, was drained. It was planted with geometric precision. The killing ground, the open space where attackers were once exposed to crossbow fire, was filled with specimen trees. In the 13th century, you controlled the land by building a wall that no one could cross. In the 19th century, you controlled the land by deciding exactly which species of rose was allowed to grow in it. Gardening replaced fortification as the primary expression of dominance. It was a softer, slower form of power, but it was just as absolute. But the real claim to fame here isn't the masonry, it is the herbaceous border. This is a massive, riotous wall of flowers that stretches for approximately 215 metres below the castle walls. It is a masterpiece of arts and crafts garden design, a deliberate explosion of colour against the grey stone. There is a profound irony in this. John Devaux built the cluster donjon to be the strongest thing in Scotland. The Halliburtons built the murder hole to be the scariest thing in Scotland. The Ruthvens built the Renaissance lodging to be the most fashionable thing in Scotland. But the thing that actually put Dirleton in the record books wasn't the stone that killed people. It was the petunias. The battle is over, the moss troopers are gone, the witches are gone, the mortar shells have stopped falling, the lawyers have stopped arguing over the title deeds. In the end, the herbaceous border defeated the curtain wall. The softest thing in the castle turned out to be the only thing that couldn't be destroyed. And so the walls remain, not whole, not triumphant, not even particularly useful. The donjon still rises from its black volcanic rock, its broken ribs open to the sky. The mortar has loosened. The vaults are hollow. Wind moves freely now through chambers once guarded by men who believed stone could solve the problem of time. It never could. Armies tested these walls. Hunger tested them. Politics tested them. Faith tested them. Gunpowder finished the argument. And still the rock remains. Below, the fields of East Lothian continue their quiet agricultural rhythm. Ploughed, planted, harvested, and ploughed again. The same soil that fed medieval garrisons now feeds sheep and barley and summer visitors with picnic baskets. The peas and beans, once stripped by soldiers, grow back each spring without complaint. Inside the courtyard, where fear once dripped from murder holes and prisoners waited in the dark below the chapel floor, there is lavender now, roses, orderly borders of colour measured in careful Victorian symmetry. The scent of time rises where once there was smoke. Stone remembers violence, gardens remember patience. The castle has been a fortress, a prison, a palace, a ruin, and finally a landscape. Each generation reshaped it according to its fears. Each generation believed its version would last. None of them did. What endures is simpler: the basalt under the donjon, the salt wind from the Firth of Forth, the slow erosion of edges. If you stand among the ruins at dusk, you can feel how small the arguments were. The kings, the sieges, the conspiracies, even the mortars that shattered the towers now feel like brief interruptions in a much longer silence. The walls no longer defend anything, they simply stand. And in that standing, cracked, softened, overgrown, there is a kind of peace that no garrison ever managed to manufacture. If Edinburgh Castle is the CEO of Scottish fortifications, looming, aggressive and sitting in the corner office on top of a volcano, then Craigmillar is middle management. It sits just 3 miles southeast of the capital. It doesn't dominate the skyline with a dramatic movie poster cliff. Instead, it occupies a sensible, slightly raised ridge. It has good views, decent drainage, and excellent access to the main road. It is the architectural equivalent of a sturdy Volvo, reliable, visible, and built to survive a collision, but not trying to compensate for anything. If you ask a Romantic historian about the name, they will tell you it comes from the Gaelic Craigmillar Ard, meaning high bare rock. This sounds majestic. It sounds like a place where heroes stand in the wind. But if you ask a linguist who has had a few ales, they might point out that Craig is Scots for rock, and Miller might just mean mill. There is a strong possibility that for centuries this wasn't a high bare rock of destiny. It was just the rock by the mill. It wasn't a fortress. It was an industrial landmark. For the first few centuries of recorded history, this rock wasn't about warfare. It was about revenue. The land belonged to the monks of Dunfermline Abbey. Now, medieval monks were not just in the business of saving souls. They were in the business of property management. Craigmillar was an estate. It was a portfolio asset. It produced wool, grain, and rent. The monks didn't build a castle here because monks don't need to hide behind walls. They hide behind God. For them, Craigmillar was a balance sheet entry. It was a farm with a prayer schedule. But by 1374, the spreadsheet changed hands. King Robert II, looking to reward loyalty and perhaps pay off some debts, granted the lands to Sir Simon Preston. The Prestons are important. They weren't ancient, blood-soaked warlords from the Highlands. They were the sheriffs of Edinburgh. They were wealthy merchants, magistrates and administrators. They were the new money of the 14th century. When Simon Preston took over, he didn't need a farm. He needed a billboard. In the 14th century, you didn't buy a Porsche to show you had made it. You built a stone tower house. We tend to think castles are built on courage and military necessity. They aren't. They are built on surplus income. Before a single stone was laid at Craigmillar, there had to be 200 years of boring, successful farming. The cows paid for the crenellations, the peace paid for the war, and finally there is the location itself. Craigmillar's superpower isn't its height, it's its proximity. It is close enough to Edinburgh that you can ride into town, bribe a few officials, attend a royal court and be home for dinner. But it is far enough away that when the capital inevitably catches fire, gets the plague, or gets invaded by the English, you can pull up the drawbridge and wait it out in the suburbs. It was the ultimate commuter castle, safe, convenient, and ready for the renovation that was about to turn a farm into a fortress. By the late 1300s, the Prestons had the land, the title, and the job. Now they needed the office. Sir Simon Preston didn't hire an architect to design a fantasy palace with spires and drawbridges. He was a sheriff, not a poet. He built a tower house, specifically an L-plan tower. To the modern eye, an L-plan tower looks a bit like a harsh stone apartment block. It is a simple rectangle with a smaller wing jammed onto the side, forming an L. It isn't romantic. It is efficient. It is the architectural equivalent of a heavy-duty filing cabinet that can also survive a siege. The logic of the L-plan is brutally simple. By sticking a wing out from the main block, you create a corner. If someone tries to break down your front door, you can stand in the wing and shoot them in the back. It is a self-cleaning entryway. It combines the three things a rising medieval family needed most: height to see the neighbours coming, thick walls to stop them from visiting, and enough bedrooms to house the staff. This tower is the real Craigmillar. Everything else you see at the site today, the courtyards, the gardens, the ranges, is just an extension added by later generations who wanted more legroom. But the tower is the original start-up headquarters. The walls are 3 meters thick. Now, 3 meters is excessive. You don't need 3 meters of stone to stop a 14th century arrow. You build walls that thick for the same reason a bank builds a massive marble lobby: to look solvent. The Prestons were performing legitimacy. In a world where power was often taken by force, a wall that thick sends a memo to the local peasantry that says, "We are not moving." Inside, the heart of the operation was the Great Hall. We tend to imagine medieval halls filled with drunken knights, roasting boars and minstrels playing lutes. The reality at Craigmillar was likely much drier. This was a place of administration with teeth. Remember, the Prestons were sheriffs. This room wasn't a party venue, it was a courtroom. It was where rents were collected, disputes were settled, and justice was dispensed. The architecture reflects this. It is built to host, judge, and command. The fireplace is huge, not just for warmth, but because a massive fire makes the guy sitting in front of it look impressive. The windows are high up, letting in light, but keeping the sheriff backlit and intimidating. It is designed to make the tenant farmer standing in the middle of the floor feel small, cold, and likely to pay up. The rest of the tower is a study in security as routine. The private rooms are small. The staircases are narrow spirals twisting clockwise to give a right-handed swordsman, the defender, the advantage over the intruder. This implies a very specific worldview. The Prestons designed their home on the assumption that at any moment, during breakfast, during a meeting, or while asleep, someone might try to kill them. Security wasn't a feature, it was a lifestyle. They built a house where the daily commute from the bedroom to the hall involved navigating 3 defensive choke points. Why did this specific design spread all over Scotland? Because it worked. The Elplan Tower was the ultimate budget castle. It didn't require the massive resources of a royal concentric fortress like Caerlaverock or Beaumaris. You didn't need a national treasury to build it. You just needed a successful estate and a good mason. For the Prestons, this tower was more than a house. It was a resume in stone. It proved they were permanent. They had transformed the rock by the mill into a seat of justice, turning a pile of limestone into a political argument that they belonged at the top of the food chain. By the 15th century, the Preston family had a problem that every successful startup eventually faces. They had outgrown their garage. The Elplan Tower was secure, impressive, and very thick, but it was also cramped. If you wanted to host a royal court or even just a very large dinner party, you couldn't do it in a vertical filing cabinet. The Prestons needed to expand. So they did what any booming corporation does. They built a campus. They constructed a massive curtain wall around the tower, creating a courtyard that turned the singular tower house into a sprawling fortified complex. This wasn't just about adding square footage, it was about defining the perimeter. In the medieval world, a wall doesn't just keep people out, it defines who is in. It separates the staff from the executives. But the Prestons didn't just build a wall, they built a theatre. If you look up at the battlements, you see a row of machicolations. These are the stone corbels that project out from the wall, leaving gaps between them. The technical function is to allow defenders to drop heavy objects, boiling water, or just general unpleasantness onto the heads of anyone trying to batter down the door. However, at Craigmillar, these are largely performative. They are the architectural equivalent of a beware of dog sign, where the dog is a 2-ton rock. They are designed to make you imagine the violence before it happens. They are a psychological deterrent, a way of saying, we have thought very specifically about how to kill you, and we have built a special balcony for it. It is defence as performance art. Then there is the matter of the landscaping. Just outside the new walls, the Prestons dug a fish pond. But they didn't dig a circle or a square. They dug it in the shape of a massive letter. This is the ultimate corporate flex. It stands, obviously, for Preston. It is a monogram carved into the earth itself. It is a level of branding that would make a modern marketing department weep with envy. But it wasn't just ego. It was also a refrigerator. In a Catholic Scotland where you couldn't eat meat on Fridays or during Lent, a fish pond was a survival engine. It was a guarantee of fresh protein when the cows were off the menu. A well-stocked pond meant you could feed a garrison or a guest list without relying on the market. The P didn't just stand for the family name, it stood for prepared. It was a message to the neighbours that the Prestons had the resources to reshape the land, the foresight to stock the larder, and the ego to sign their work. The castle had stopped being just a house, it was now a brand. By 1544, the Prestons discovered that while a massive water-filled pea in the garden is great for branding, it doesn't stop international politics from kicking down your front door. This brings us to one of the most absurdly named events in British history, the Rough Wooing. It sounds like a bad romance novel, but it was actually a military campaign of spectacular violence. King Henry VIII of England decided that his son, Edward, should marry the infant Mary, Queen of Scots. The Scots, perhaps sensing that Henry wasn't the best father-in-law to have, politely declined. Henry's response was to send an army north with a simple instruction: burn everything until they change their minds. It was diplomacy by arson. It was a hostile takeover, where the hostility involved actual fire. The man in charge of this wooing was the Earl of Hertford. He wasn't a general looking for glory, he was a liquidator looking for assets to destroy. He marched on Edinburgh, and Craigmillar, sitting right there in the commuter belt, was first on the list. The story goes that Sir Simon Preston, the current CEO of the estate, tried to cut a deal. He opened the gates and surrendered the castle on the condition that it wouldn't be damaged. It was a sensible corporate move. Cut your losses, save the infrastructure and live to fight another fiscal quarter. Hertford agreed, and then he burned it anyway. Whether this was a calculated betrayal or just the natural result of letting an army of bored, angry men into a rich house is debated by historians. But the result was the same. The English troops didn't just loot the place, they gutted it. This teaches us a very important lesson about medieval architecture. Stone survives, but comfort burns. When we see a ruin today, we often think of walls falling down. But in 1544, the walls of Craigmillar stood perfectly still. The 3-metre thick masonry didn't care about the fire. What burned was the livability. The timber roofs, the oak floors, the expensive tapestries, the legal records, and the furniture, the software of the castle, were deleted. The hardware remained, but it was now just a hollow, smoke-stained shell. Hertford proved that you don't need to conquer a castle to destroy it. You don't need to knock it down with a trebuchet. You just need a torch and a few hours. It is a terrifyingly cheap way to wage war. You leave the enemy with their walls, but you take away their roof, forcing them to spend the next 10 years and a fortune just to get back to zero. The Prestons were left with a very impressive, very fireproof stone box that was completely uninhabitable. The pea in the garden was still there, but the refrigerator was empty. In late 1566, Craigmillar Castle stopped being a family home and became a royal safe-house. Mary, Queen of Scots, arrived at the gates, not for a holiday, but for a breakdown. She was suffering from extreme burnout. She had just given birth to the future King James VI. Her husband, Lord Darnley, was a chaotic liability, and her nobles were plotting in every corner of the capital. She didn't come to Craigmillar for the view. She came because it was the only place near Edinburgh where she could close the door. The historical record describes her condition simply as unwell. This is a polite way of saying she was physically and mentally shattered. Historians have spent centuries arguing over whether she had gastric ulcers, porphyria, or just severe depression. But the diagnosis doesn't matter as much as the result. She was a queen who had lost the will to rule. It is reported, though we should treat all royal quotes with a pinch of salt, that she was heard muttering, "I wish I were dead." This isn't the statement of a tragic romantic heroine. It is the statement of a woman who is tired of the betrayal and tired of the constant surveillance of the court. When a queen is sick, she doesn't go to a spa, she goes to a fortress. Castles like Craigmillar were used as medicine. The thick walls didn't just keep out armies, they kept out prying eyes. They offered controlled access. In a palace like Holyrood, there are leaks, spies and ambassadors watching every cough. In a castle like Craigmillar, you can control who walks up the stairs. The stone offered the only privacy a monarch could ever hope for. There is a local tradition that the hamlet just down the road is called Little France, because Mary's French servants and courtiers were quartered there. Whether this is true or just a bit of historical branding by later generations is debated. It is improbable that the entire French retinue was camped out in a muddy field in December while the Queen was in the tower. But the name stuck, a reminder that for a few weeks this corner of East Lothian wasn't really Scotland. It was an enclave of the French court, huddled around a sick woman. But royal recovery is never leisure. It is strategic withdrawal under supervision. While Mary lay in bed staring at the ceiling of the Queen's room, the castle wasn't quiet. It was buzzing. The castle had become a pressure chamber. It was quiet, private, and close to Edinburgh, perfect for meetings that didn't want witnesses. While the Queen slept, the men in the room next door were not discussing her health. They were discussing her husband, and they were about to make a decision that would turn Craigmillar from a hospital into a crime scene. While Mary was recovering in the upper chambers, the castle hosted perhaps the most famous unrecorded meeting in Scottish history. The problem was Lord Darnley. He was the king consort, the father of the future James VI, and universally regarded by the Scottish nobility as a disaster. He was arrogant, violent, and politically unstable. The men running the country, figures like the Earl of Bothwell, the Earl of Argyll, and the Secretary of State William Maitland, sat down in the lower halls of Craigmillar to discuss a solution. They didn't need a fortress to fight a siege. They needed a soundproof room to solve a personnel problem. The result of this meeting was known as the Craigmillar Bond. Historians have argued for centuries about exactly what was written on the paper, or if a physical paper was even signed. We don't have the document. Smart conspirators generally don't file their treason in the National Archives. They burn it. But the agreement itself was real. The nobles agreed that Darnley had to be removed for the good of the state. The language used was likely bureaucratic and vague, phrases about the public good and necessary measures. But the subtext was lethal. They weren't planning a resignation. They were planning a removal. This creates a chilling contrast in the geography of the castle. Upstairs you had a sick queen, trying to sleep, desperate for peace. Downstairs you had her closest advisers deciding that she would sleep better as a widow. The plan hatched within these walls didn't stay there. 2 months later, in February 1567, Lord Darnley was found dead in the garden of Kirker Field in Edinburgh, the house having been blown up with gunpowder. The blast that killed the king began as a quiet conversation in a room at Craigmillar. At that moment, the castle ceased to be a defensive structure. It became a conference room with stone walls and no minutes taken. It was the place where the Darnley problem was solved, setting in motion the chain of events that would eventually lead to Mary's abdication, imprisonment, and execution. The stone walls kept the Queen safe, but they couldn't save her from her own friends. By 1660, the era of the warlord was over. The era of the lawyer had begun. The Prestons, who had held the castle for nearly 300 years, eventually sold up. The new owner was Sir John Gilmore. He wasn't a sheriff or a knight. He was the Lord President of the Court of Session. He was the top lawyer in Scotland. When Sir John moved in, he looked at the massive, damp, 3-metre-thick walls of the medieval tower and came to a sensible conclusion. Living in a fortress is miserable. He didn't need arrow slits. He needed light. He didn't need a murder hole, he needed a study. So he embarked on a radical renovation. He built the West Range, a new wing that turned the castle courtyard into a mansion. The architecture here tells you exactly how much the world had changed. The windows are large and rectangular. The rooms are arranged for comfort, not defence. The fireplace isn't designed to roast an ox. It's designed to warm a judge's feet. The castle had stopped being a machine for war and had become a very impressive background for a legal career. But even luxury has an expiration date. By the 18th century, the Gilmores decided that even the modern wing was too drafty. They did what every wealthy family eventually does. They moved out. They built a nice, warm Georgian house nearby called the Inch. and they left Craigmillar to the elements. The castle became a garden ornament. It was a romantic ruin at the bottom of the drive, a place for picnics and sketches, not politics. But just as the castle was settling into a quiet retirement, it delivered one last piece of drama. In 1813, workmen were poking around the crumbling masonry of the vaulting when they reportedly found a hollow space in the wall. Inside, standing upright, was a human skeleton. We don't know who it was. We don't know if it was a prisoner from the Preston era, a victim of the rough justice of the 16th century, or just a gruesome local legend that got out of hand. But the discovery, real or embellished, changed the way people looked at the ruin. It proves that a building like this never really stops working. Even when the roof falls in and the lawyers move out, the castle starts generating its own plot. The violence moves off stage, into the walls themselves, turning a piece of real estate into a ghost story. The skeleton in the wall became the final tenant, a permanent reminder that while you can remodel the kitchen, you can never quite scrub the history out of the stone. By the 20th century, Craigmillar Castle had one final hurdle to clear: relevance. It wasn't a fortress anymore. Artillery had made walls obsolete 400 years ago. It wasn't a home anymore. The Gilmores had moved to a house with central heating. It was just a very large, very expensive pile of rocks in a field. In 1946, the state stepped in. The castle passed into the care of the Ministry of Works, now Historic Environment Scotland. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was a change in management. The castle stopped being a private asset and became a public liability. The job of the Stones shifted from protecting the Prestons to educating the public. But unlike many Scottish castles that were reduced to jagged stumps or romantic piles of rubble, Craigmillar is unusually legible. You can still read the corporate hierarchy in the stone. You can stand in the L-plan tower and feel the claustrophobia of the 14th century. You can walk the ramparts and see the 15th century machicolations. You can stand in the 17th century range and see where the lawyers drank their wine. It is a complete complex, a fossilised cross-section of Scottish power. This legibility is exactly why it found a new career in the 21st century. If you are a fan of Outlander, you might recognise Craigmillar not as a castle, but as Ardsmuir Prison. It is fitting in a dark way. The castle spent centuries trying to keep people out, and now it is famous for a story about keeping people in. This brings us to the logic of ruins on screen. Why do film crews love places like this? Because they are emotionally pre-lit. You don't need to spend budget on set design to make a scene feel cold, old, or foreboding. The stone does the work for you. The gloom is free. When an actor leans against a wall that has seen 600 years of rain, the audience feels the weight of it without a word of dialogue, and so we reach the final transformation. The rock began as a quarry and a farm. It became a fortress for the Prestons. It became a hospital for a broken queen. It became a conference room for a murder plot. It became a mansion for a lawyer. And finally it became a set. The basalt hasn't changed. The rain is the same. The view of Edinburgh is the same. The only thing that changes is the script. The stones are still working. They just have a different job description now. They have survived everything. The English, the fire, the lawyers, and the neglect, to become the one thing that never really dies. A good location.